Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Especialmente Normal International Edition. I'm Madalena Ferreira. We have here also Filipa Ferreira. Behind the image we have Telma Santos, and our special guest of today is Aisha. Welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, so Aisha will, like we were discussing before, we will try to do a small introduction. If there's something wrong, please correct us, and then we'll start the conversation. So Aisha was born in Pakistan, and is
no.
Yeah, so you were born in the US and then you went to Pakistan?
That's right.
Okay. So she was born in the US and then she went to Pakistan. She's the proud mom of 2 boys. Is that part correct? Yes?
That part's right.
Okay. You lived in Lahore and that's where you work. Is that correct too?
That's correct.
She got a bachelor in English literature and the second one in music education for South Asia.
That's right. How did you find that out?
She's a teacher, a feminist, and for 7 years she led the Debate Society of Pakistan. Okay. So we'll get into that South Asia because we were curious about that. Okay.
So in a previous conversation that we have, you mentioned that you were 10 years old in Pakistan, and Pakistan was under a dictatorship. What memories do you have from those times? Can you speak a little bit about those times?
Sure. One of my earliest memories is this is one of my first political memories, really. Yeah. Which is that there was
were you aware of what was happening?
A little bit. I remember how angry my grandfather was about it because there was this referendum about whether Pakistanis felt that Pakistan should be ruled by laws that were basically Islamic. But the way they asked the question was like, do you believe in Islam and do you think that that should rule your life? And they assumed that if you said yes to that, then that means that you want an Islamic government and you want this dictator. So it was very convenient how that was set up. And like my grandfather was quite a religious man, but didn't want the dictator. He was very, very angry about it. He thinks that these two things are not the same. So I didn't really understand it at the time, but I remember how upset he was about it. So that's one memory. Another memory is I realize now how important that was in Pakistani feminist history, so this same dictator passed these laws, it's called the Zina and Hudud Ordinance, which basically says that you can be put to death for having sex outside of marriage. And what's truly horrible about it is that it set it up so that in order to successfully accuse someone of rape, a woman had to have 4 witnesses. And you're just like, I mean, that's crazy. Like, how often is it going to happen that someone is raped in front of 4 witnesses who are going to be willing to testify, right? I mean, if they were there and it's just not going to happen. Anyway, so there's this organization called the Women's Action Forum, and they started, they had a street protest against the Zina ordinance. And I remember talking to my mom about it, and she was just like, well, I don't like the law, but I don't think women should be out on the streets. And so that was an interesting, again, it's one of those very clear memories. I was 8 or 9 years old at the time. Yeah. And then there were some stuff that I found out later, like my school. And it's interesting. I mean, I teach and work at the school where I studied. So if you can see that door behind me, that door led to the administrator's office when I was a student, and you were in big trouble if you had to go into that office. And this room, it was different. It used to be part of a classroom. They've put in more partitions and things.
Okay.
So it's kind of interesting. This was my 8th grade classroom that I now work in.
Yeah, and now it's your office.
I know that I come back to our previous schools sometimes with volunteers to do activities, and it's hard enough to enter like the teacher's lounge. It was very weird. But to be
It's a weird sensation,
to be the boss when teaching in your previous school, that was,
And I mean, the same principal is my boss. So it's very interesting to have that relationship change also. Yeah. Like, she's known me pretty much all my life. So, so I mean, we were talking about this, and I mean, at this school, we used to have, still do in fact, compulsory dance lessons and compulsory music class. So it was a part, all the way through 11th grade, you had singing classes and you had dance classes. And but under the dictatorship, they had to pretend that the dance teacher was doing something else. They couldn't have it on their tax data that they were paying a dance teacher. So things like that. I mean, so these are things that are like, they're comical at one level, but they're not. I mean, they really shape how people feel. There was a lot of talk about changing the education system so that all students had to learn Arabic and everyone had to go to Urdu medium schools. They wouldn't allow any English medium schools. And so there was a period of 2 years or so where we had to have math and social studies classes both in English and in Urdu. So learning the terminology in both languages and stuff. And it's doable. It's not that it's not doable, but it was hard. And it seems kind of pointless if you're not going to carry through with it, which they didn't, of course. So.
That's true. So, and you growing up, you spent a lot of time both in Pakistan and USA. How was the experience of living in such different realities?
That's an interesting question.
How did you manage to handle that?
I was 6 when we moved to Pakistan. And I had visited Pakistan once before. But my grandfather had come to the U.S. And, I mean, my parents had always made sure that we had a connection. So they always spoke to us in Urdu. I knew a lot of kids, actually, with similar backgrounds who didn't know Urdu. But my parents made sure that we were fluent in Urdu. One of my early memories is my dad saying no. I asked him for something. They said, well, you have to ask for it in Urdu first. Before you can get it, you have to ask for it in Urdu. And it was very frustrating at the time. But I really appreciate it because I see kids now who come back to Pakistan and they don't have the language, and it makes life a lot harder for them. So that part was easier. It was the early 80s. So you didn't have all this internet exchange of stuff. I missed peanut butter a lot. I missed my friends. And I didn't really understand why we had to come to Pakistan. I mean, I was very frustrated with that. And I also had a really hard time fitting in at school. So like my big sister, she was very happy to move back to Pakistan. She had always
How old she was?
She was 10. She was 10 and I was 6.
Yeah.
And she was much closer to my grandfather's than I was. So she was someone who could sit for hours just listening to his stories. And I liked the Dukes of Hazzard. I would rather be playing outside with my brother. I was quite a tomboy. And that's a hard thing to be in Pakistan, especially back in the 80s. It's a little bit less difficult now. But I mean, wearing jeans, a girl wearing jeans was weird then.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what
that
were
was hard.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what were the things that you knew you could do in USA and not in Pakistan or something like that? So wearing jeans, for example. What were the
I mean, like,
contrasts?
it wasn't that at home I couldn't. I mean, my mom and dad were fine with it.
Okay.
It was just that I knew that if I went somewhere, I was going to get grief about it from other people. So, I mean, in that sense, I was very lucky. My parents, my extended family were all really supportive. So, I mean, I might get a little bit of affectionate teasing about being a tomboy, but it was very clear that it was affectionate. So it was okay. It was more challenging when I got to be a bit older. I'm really not a very domestic sort. And, a girl who doesn't like dressing up, a girl who isn't interested in cooking and clothes, and I just couldn't have cared less about those things. So that was hard. But it's weird, sometimes like just talking too loud or laughing too loud, these are not proper things. And so you might get into trouble for doing those. And it's always seemed very strange to me. Part of that, though, is about subculture. It's not true for every part of Pakistan. It's not true of every culture in Pakistan. But in my family, we come from a very traditional Urdu-speaking family, and that made it. There's a level of propriety that is more, and I compare Urdu speaking and Punjabi. Punjab is the province that Lahore is the capital of.
I know, I was there.
Next time you come, you have to come to Lahore.
Okay, yeah, I promise. Next time. I didn't know
so I compare the difference between Punjabi and Urdu-speaking culture like American and English culture.
Yeah.
So Urdu speaking are much more like the British, much more proper, much more, and understated and all of those things. And I'm an American kid.
But now you live in Pakistan.
I do.
So, but where do you feel most at home? There or in US?
That's an interesting question. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was visiting the U.S. Some of my closest friends are still my college friends from the U.S. And one of them in particular, he and I were having a conversation. He lives very close to our college town. I went to Oberlin, and he lives in Cleveland. And I hadn't been to the U.S. in about 8 years at that time. It had been a really long gap.
Aisha, so you went back to the U.S. for college, and then right after you came to Pakistan?
Yeah, that's right. I went to, I completed high school here, and I did what you would call a 2-year college degree here. And then I went to the U.S. and did a second bachelor's degree. And so this is a friend from that second bachelor's degree. And because I went into the college campus, and I had my elder son was with me, and I walked into the conservatory building, the practice rooms and all of that, and I smelled the rosin, and I started weeping. Like it was just not even, without even realizing it, I just wept. And my son got a little worried because he was like, "What's wrong?" I was like, "No, there's nothing wrong." And it was just, smell does this weird thing to you. It brings back a lot of memory very powerfully. Anyway, so I was talking to this friend of mine later. We saw him, I guess, the following day or so. And I said to him that Oberlin is still the place I feel most myself. And well, it is nice.
Home is a feeling, right?
when he says to me that, but Aisha, you have to think about that because you're saying that you're most yourself in a place where you can't be really. So that's, I mean, that's and that really got me thinking that, oh, well, that's kind of true. And you have to find a way to be yourself where you are. And that was a really challenging kind of, it's a very loving challenge. And it really changed how I was thinking about things. I figured out ways to do things differently after that because I was just like, oh, yeah, I need to make this space to be me. And it helped a lot. So if you asked me this question 8 or 9 years ago, the answer would have been very clear in my head. But really all my life, I know that I'm always away from home. It doesn't matter where I am, I'm away from home because I have more than one. So there's always a part of me that is not at home. But the U.S. and Pakistan are both home, very much so.
And you also lived in United Emirates, right?
Yes, that's not home.
Okay, that's not home. But how was the experience of living there?
You know, it's interesting. I know a lot of people who live there very happily. But most of the time, when I say that I lived in the UAE for 4 years, I add for my sins at the end. So it felt like a punishment to me. It really did. I was really unhappy. And some of that had to do with where things were in our life at the time. But some of it was also just, it's a place that makes it very hard for a person like me to be at home. So I had gone there from working at this school. I had been working at this school before we left. And I was a well-respected teacher. I was very proud of the work I had been doing. And I went there. I couldn't find a job. I couldn't, because if I wanted to apply as a U.S. Citizen or whatever and show my American education, they then wanted me not to have Pakistani teaching on my, they're like, we'll consider you a Pakistani. And they had actually separate, there were separate application portals for Americans versus Asians. It was insane, right? I mean, I understand if they say we have a separate portal for Emiratis and a separate portal for foreigners. Okay, I get that. But that wasn't it. And it wasn't even for Arabic speakers versus non-Arabic speakers. That, again, would be something that, like, there are legitimate educational reasons to have those separations. But this was just, no, like, what label can I put on you? And seriously, if I had walked in saying I'm an American, they would see my skin color and not acknowledge me as an American. And the other thing was I refused to dishonor my career that way. I'm proud of the work I've done. I'm not going to pretend I haven't been working these last 7 years. And the kind of salary, I mean, they were offering me less money than I had been making here. And the cost of living there is like 10 times as high. And so it makes no sense to me to be, so that part was very hard. It was the first time in my life since I'd been an adult that I wasn't earning a salary. That was very, very hard for me. I'd been working since I was 19 years old. And so all the time that I was a student, I also had a job. And so it was really hard for me in that way to be dependent economically on my husband. It was very tough for me personally. It doesn't have to be. There's nothing wrong with it. but it was just something that I could not. So the Emirates were very, very tough for me for multiple reasons.
Okay.
So Aisha, you're a teacher, as we've been talking about, and it's impossible to talk about Pakistan and education and not mention Malala. So obviously you grew up in very different time, but did you have any experience, like were you always allowed to go to school growing up, or did you while growing up, did you also face any trouble in terms of getting your education because for being a girl and all of that?
No, I mean, never. There was never a question in my household about whether or not we would go to school, how much education we would get. That was just never. I mean, you have to remember, though, that my mom and her sisters all have bachelor's or master's degrees. And that was unusual. I mean, my maternal grandfather was a school teacher himself. And he valued education a great deal. I never met my grandmother, so I'm not sure. She died about a week before I was born. But so for me personally, it was never an issue. And in fact, there are many things that a lot of my friends have experienced, a lot of my students experience. I see it, that for me, it was really hard to understand because in my home, those things were just never questions. But I have cousins for whom I know that their brothers' educations were a bigger priority than theirs. So that was very clear also, that there were in my extended family examples of parents who put much more emphasis on their son's education. But even so, I can't think of anyone in the clan at large who didn't send their daughters to school or who would think that that was okay. So it was about quality of education. They might spend less on it, but there's no one who's going to say, okay, no, girls don't have to go to college or whatever. Yeah.
Good. So yeah, we did find out that you have a bachelor in music education for South Asia. That sounds very specific. So,
okay.
How did that happen?
So this goes back to what we were talking about with the Zia era, where education in music became something that you weren't allowed to do, right? So public funding of the arts was drastically cut. You just didn't have places where kids could learn music. It was really hard for me to find an instructor, and even the ones that you did find, they weren't people who had professional training of any sort. I mean, like going to Oberlin just changed my conception of what it meant to be a musician, and like the idea that you could be someone who had been getting lessons since you were 3 or whatever, even though, and it wasn't, I mean, the only people here for whom that was true was people who were from musician families. Like it was a given that that's what they were going to do. But if you were someone who came from a family where people are, expecting that you're basically going to grow up to be some kind of educated professional, then the idea that you would do music was just pretty much unthinkable. And this is one thing where girls are particularly different in that and maybe Mada, you saw this a little bit as well, that in the subcontinent, in South Asia, music, women performing music have been connected with the idea of courtesans for a very long time. And so there's this whole thing that a girl from a respectable family does not get involved in performing music because that says lots of things about her morals that are just not necessarily true at all. But, So I always longed for someone who would teach me. And it was always a problem because there was this question of, well, so-and-so offers lessons, but I'm not really comfortable sending you to this person for lessons. I don't think they're a respectable person. So this kind of issue was, and so I thought that I wanted to be a music teacher because I was like, there've got to be lots of kids like me who want to learn, and they should have a teacher. And so I went, and then, as I said, you start learning music theory, and you're just like, well, but this doesn't quite fit. And you don't have formal music theory education in the music of South Asia, at least not in Pakistan. I think there's more of it in India, but travel between India and Pakistan is always an iffy thing. So that wasn't something that it wasn't a feasible thing to think about. And so I was wanting to be a music teacher. And I spent several years learning theory and music history and so my independent research project was about how to modify pedagogical materials so that they could be used in Pakistan. And that's what I was working on. And that's why that's the for South Asia part of it.
Okay.
So that's how that came about.
You also said that the foundation of your career is that you must do something meaningful with your life. This was in our previous debate. Listen, I was taking notes. So when did you first know you wanted to become a teacher? Was it like in the continuation of what you're talking now about the music and wanting to...
That's part of it. I mean, when I was a little kid, being a teacher was one possibility. Like, I remember, when you're asked to write an essay when you're a little kid, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Mm-hmm. And like, a teacher was always a possibility. I was never able to say, no, this is what I'm going to do. I was like, well, I'm thinking of this and this and this and this was, so being an archaeologist was a possibility. Being a cancer researcher was a possibility. But, by the time I was in high school, I had really boiled it down to teacher or archaeologist. I mean, it was, I was interested in archaeology, and I found out very early on that I was good at teaching. So in kindergarten, I got in, I wouldn't say I got in trouble, but my teacher was concerned that I wasn't completing my work. And the reason I wasn't completing my work was because once I'd figured out how to do it, I was helping other people complete theirs. I was bored with actually doing it. It was much more fun to help other people how to figure it out. So there was that, helping kids younger than me understand stuff. This was something that I enjoyed doing always. So but I would say when I knew that that's what I had to do was when at Oberlin, when they put me in a classroom. And part of their program, one of the great things about the music ed program there was that they put you in a classroom your first semester. They make sure, it's for a very short period, but they make sure that you start spending time in a classroom right from the beginning so that you know whether it's something that you want to do. And for me, it's always been true that that's where I'm most alive. Like, when I'm in the classroom is where I'm most alive. There's just nothing like it. So that's where...
You knew for sure.
Yeah.
That's nice. Growing up, did you have a teacher that was particularly special or that inspired you?
Oh, a bunch.
I think all teachers leave a mark on you, good or bad, but teachers...
Yeah, that's true.
That's special, true. Right?
Yeah. I was very lucky. I haven't had a lot of teachers who I remember really well because they were so mean, I'm really
those
lucky
are
that
important
way.
too.
Yeah, they are important. But no, I mean, I had a bunch of English teachers that I really loved, a lot of literature teachers who, and that's part of, I've continued to love that. They really, so it's hard to talk about any one teacher who really stands out was actually a geography teacher, Mrs. Shair. She was amazing. Like, she herself was from Bengal, and she'd married a Pathan soldier. And this is like, I mean, she was from a Hindu family, he was Muslim, and they did this pre-partition. And I mean, it was, and he was in the army, like, and so his wife was Indian, and she was the kind of person where when the war was happening, in which eventually Bangladesh split away from Pakistan, she wouldn't sit down at the dining table with her husband for, and they had a great marriage otherwise. I mean, this is a man who, like, even when they were very old, he always made tea for everyone. Like, if you went to their house, he poured the tea. That was just a given. So, but she was really amazing. She was someone who explained the Zina and Hudud ordinances to us. And you know, I was at a girls' school at a time when people weren't talking about these things. So she walked us through what the provisions of the law were and what it meant for women, and how it was different from what the Quranic teaching actually is, and how it had twisted stuff around. And so, I mean, all of that was incredibly, and she was someone who really made you think about what it meant to be Pakistani and what it could mean to be Pakistani. And so all of that was, so Mrs. Shair, I suppose, she's been a huge influence. But there are a bunch of others. It's not really fair.
Yeah. No, it's good. If you have more than one, then it means that it was a good experience overall.
Yeah.
And as a teacher, if you could only teach one thing to your students, what would that be?
To continue learning. To want to keep learning. That's it. I mean, if they walk away from my class feeling like they have to keep learning, that's it. I'm done.
And do you have any age group that you prefer to work with, or?
Different age groups for different reasons. I'm not very good with the youngest kids. Although I've done preschool music for quite a while, and I really loved doing it, but I'm a word person. I like talking and working through ideas with kids. I think middle school is in some ways the most fun because they're crazy. They're just not. They're going all over the place with hormones. Half of them are thinking like adults. Half of them are still thinking like kids. And if you get them, like if you manage to capture them right at the beginning, then they're yours forever. Like, you know, so the kids I taught my first couple of years as a teacher, we still talk because we just got along so well, and I was so excited to be a teacher and they were excited to be in my class, and it was just, so you had this synergy, and those kids still keep coming back to me. And this is 20 years later. So that part is really great. So middle school is fun for that. Older kids, the high school kids are very interesting because they can challenge you on an equal footing even. Especially the smarter kids, they'll really give you a run for your money. And for that was like, when you have the kid who you know you have to be 100% on your game the day you're teaching that kid, then that's always great. And that I've only had with high school students. And Because I mean, and that's understandable, you know. I mean, the kind of reading and the kind of where they're really going to have to push you. The younger kids can ask you questions that are challenging from an ethical or like the way the world works kind of thing. But in terms of actually in your field of expertise to push you, that's something that the older kids do better. So different kids for different reasons.
So I know in our country there is a lot that we like to change in our educational system. Is it the same for you? What do you think it will be improved?
Oh man, where to start?
A lot of things, right?
Well, okay. So you have to remember. Let's start from the beginning. So that about half our kids are out of school.
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, that's like the first thing, that about half our kids just are not making it to school. And then even the half that are making it to school, I mean, you know, I did not realize for a very long time how privileged I was. But it's very unusual in Pakistan to come from a family where people have been going to college for generations. So, I mean, my grandfather was one grandfather was a doctor, one grandfather was a school teacher, his siblings were lawyers, my dad was an engineer, his brothers were engineers and chartered accountants, and so, I mean, so we are an educated family and have been an educated family for generations. And I just grew up taking that for granted, not understanding that most people don't grow up in a house full of books. Like people ask me, I don't know, have you ever seen those privilege questionnaires where they're just like, well, did you grow up with, and like one of them once said, like, were there more than 10 books in your house? And I was just like, what? Like there are more than 10 books in practically every room in my house. So that was very strange for me. But so many kids grow up without that kind of education at all. And even the ones who do go to school, a lot of the schools, the government education system is dismal. There's just no other word for it. It's rote learning. It's rote learning of things that are out of date. The textbooks are bad. And most recently, they're trying to put into place actually something they're calling the single national curriculum. And I'm someone who's very upset about that because what they're doing is essentially saying that private schools have to teach badly too. So, I mean, yes, I teach at a private school. It is a privilege. The kids who come here are privileged. But the reason I don't teach at a government school is that I can't teach. I won't be allowed to teach. The laws about what ideas are acceptable are so stringent that it's become increasingly challenging, actually. The legal environment, I mean, we had a governor assassinated in, I'm trying to remember the year now, 2010, maybe 2011. He was assassinated for arguing that the blasphemy law should be amended. That's all he was saying, that there need to be changes because right now it's being abused. He wasn't even arguing that there shouldn't be a blasphemy law. He was simply saying that you need to change the procedural aspect of it. And he was assassinated by his own bodyguard. And that's the environment that you're working in. And so if you go to a government school, I mean, I've been hauled into the curriculum board office over what textbooks we're using in our school. And their objections are honestly laughable. And it would be hilarious if it weren't so serious. Like, so I will get a message on my phone from a bureaucrat with a picture of a textbook image and saying, is this being taught in your school? And the objections can be as silly as, why does this book mention going to church on Sunday? This is a Muslim country. Why is it talking about the church? You're just like, well, I mean, there are Christians in our country. And even if there weren't, there are Christians in the world. And it's okay to acknowledge that they exist. It's just, so those kinds of things. And now they're just tightening things and making it harder and harder and harder to teach. That part's very hard.
So, and you were the president of the Debating Society of Pakistan for 7 years.
Right. Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit about this experience, or what attracted to this job?
Oh, well, in 1992, I was on the national debate team that competed at the World Schools Debating Championship. And in 1992 and 93. And it's funny, people talk about girls' education, like both years there were more girls on the team than boys. And we did really well. I mean, we were semifinalists and quarterfinalists, and we were competing against England and the US and Canada and New Zealand and Australia. So it's pretty cool. And that experience of going for those debate tournaments and generally debating really shaped a lot of things for me. Like it really, for one, like in 92 when we went to England, we came into contact with the Israeli debate team. And I don't know if you know about this, but Pakistan does not recognize Israel as a country. Yeah. So even the Pakistani passport says valid for all countries except Israel. And so we would not have been allowed to debate Israel, for example. Because as the national team, we couldn't. Those were the two teams that were most tight-knit at the tournament. And it was such that we wanted to write letters to each other afterwards, and you didn't have email at the time. And so we would send letters to Switzerland or the US and have other people forward them. So I had pen pals in Israel as a teenager. And just that opening up of my world, that things that you had been taught were unquestionable, all of a sudden you saw that there was another way to look at them. And also, I mean, the intellectual skills of debating, right? The putting ideas together, learning how to speak, learning how to, like one of the things I'm really proud of is if you give me a time limit and say you have to stop at 8 minutes or you have to stop at 5 minutes, my speech will end at 4:58 or 5:02 at most. That's it. So and it doesn't have to be prepared, and that's just years and years of training. Those are really useful skills to have. So I really like that. I like that I've been taught to consider different ideas or to say that you have to argue against what you actually believe, just so that you can understand where that argument is coming from, etc. So debating really changed my life. And so when I came back to Pakistan, I started coaching the school debate team and got involved with the Debating Society at that time because the gentleman who had been in charge of selecting the Pakistani team, he was still running the organization. And he was like, oh, you're back, come on, come out. And so, it's one of those things where people who you look up to and they ask for help and you're just like, yeah, of course. And so you get involved, and then you're just like, oh yeah, you can change people's lives doing this. And then in the meantime, the debate has become very competitive in Pakistan in a way that it wasn't when I was a student myself. And so I wanted partly for people to focus more on the parts about debate that I care about, which is, and especially as I was saying earlier, when the space is closing up, you want to keep doing things that open more space up. And so that's where that commitment came from. And it was hard. I mean, there were times when, in that time I had a baby. I was still working as a teacher. And like I started that stint, we moved back from the Emirates in May, and I became president of the Debating Society in November. So, yeah, and then another year and a half, and my son was born. And so, but even like through my first year of presidency, I was pregnant for part of it, and I was on bed rest for part of it. And it was, so I mean, it's been, and you don't realize how big a portion of your brain that stuff takes up until you stop doing it. So my term ended in November, and I'm just like, oh.
What do I do with this free time?
And it's less fun and just more mental bandwidth. It's really interesting that it's like cutting off a bunch of hair all of a sudden. Yeah. But I would always want to be doing something in which my communication skills were called for. Like this is something that I was, in fact, when I took on this role as an administrator, it's something I said to my boss. It's like, you need someone who can explain to parents why what we're doing is important. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of parents, when they send kids to a fairly expensive private school, are then wanting good grades, good university admissions, and they're thinking about education in a very instrumental way. And that's really not how my boss, who started the school 40 years ago, like it's not how she thinks about education. It's not how I think about education. And so it's not the school philosophy. Mm-hmm. But you have to keep communicating that to people. You have to explain, because especially when parents are coming to you without having any experience of essentially a liberal arts education, right? So then they don't really understand what it's. They're just like, is that going to help her be a doctor? And it's just
a waste of time.
Yeah. So for me, so that's really important. Like I sometimes joke with my students that that's my superpower. Like this is why I tell you have to learn how to communicate, because if you know how to communicate, you've got a real superpower. You can get people to do things they didn't even know they wanted to do. So it would have to be something that continued using those.
Yeah. Mm. And what is a Malta's education? I hope I'm saying this right. I'm not sure. Fee, it's good?
I don't know how to say it. What? A Malta's education, because you have like the Instagram and
Amaltas. Yeah. Amaltas is the name of a tree.
Okay.
And in fact, if you see the logo, then it's the flower.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's an Amaltas flower. Okay. Now, Amaltas education, I decided that I wanted to start something where I ran these little courses for people who want to learn how to do better public speaking, or who want to learn about critical thinking, or things like that. I'm still working on exactly what form it's going to take, and the pandemic in some ways has meant more time, but then when school is in session, it means a lot less time. It's school. I think teachers and administrators both, we feel like we're working a lot harder and getting a lot less done. And so I haven't had enough time to work on that as much as I'd like. But the idea is to again, to add another space where conversation and learning how to disagree with each other without getting angry just because we disagree.
So you do also courses on public speaking for kids and adults, right?
Yes.
And so why do you think it's important to develop this skill?
Yeah. Learning to compete. Well, I mean, there's several things. One is that I think a lot of people spend a lot of time very frustrated because they are unable to communicate what they are actually feeling and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I genuinely feel that there are a lot of problems that would go away with more open and clear communication.
Mm-hmm.
Over the past few years, I've also come to realize that there are actually a lot of problems that will not go away, even if there is. Like, you can't get someone not to be racist just by communicating clearly with them. If they're that stupid, then there's not a whole lot that you can do. In terms of rational conversation isn't going to do it. The problem is different. Yeah. So things like that don't go away with open communication, but there are a lot of things that do. And there are a lot of problems and a lot of anger and a lot of violence that stems from not knowing what to do with disagreement and not knowing what to do with just having needs that aren't being met. And so for me, it's really important that people learn how to do this.
Yeah. Even to, well, I think it's important to know how to communicate, and also it's very important to know how to hear the other persons.
Oh, that's
right?
a really important part of communication.
Of communication, right?
Yeah. You're a really bad communicator if you're not listening.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you on almost everything you said until now.
Oh, wow.
That's nice.
Yeah. We read, like, in your Twitter account, you describe yourself as a strident feminist.
Yes, I do.
Comment a little bit on that.
It's something that women get told off a lot for, right? That you talk too loud, you're too opinionated. And this is part of one of the things that I was saying, that I had to figure out how to be comfortable in myself and how to be myself where I am. And being willing to say that, no, actually, yeah, I am a strident feminist, do what you want about it. That was part of that. Like being very open about the fact that I have strong opinions on the issue of women's equality was something that was important to me. And I've only realized recently that there were young women who were watching, or girls who were watching. Like it's really been something I'm really proud of. Okay, I didn't do it at the time for that reason. I did it because I had to do it. And this goes back to the debating circuit. Mm-hmm. Debate in which gender equality issue was the motion. And some kid turns around and says that women are mentally and emotionally and physically inferior. Like he just says in so many words that, and so like I was a judge. You can't say that. Like that's just factually incorrect. And this is not a debatable point at this point. And you can't say that. So that, and a lot of people at that time, like, they were just like, oh yeah, well, when Miss Aisha's there, you can't say these things. And I was just like, well, fine, it used to really get to me that it was, you only can't say them because she won't let you.
Yeah.
But, so then there was another tournament, and I'd completely forgotten about this until a few years later when one of the girls who was there reminded me that this had happened, where some young man, again, made some obnoxious, idiotic comment while I was judging. And I just got up and walked out. And I was just like, no, I will not listen to this. This is not something that you are allowed to say. And I mean, the organizers ended up apologizing for it, and the guy had to and so it was a thing, right? It became a thing where they had to deal with it. And I just did it because I was like, I'm not going to listen to this crap. But and this was before I was married that this happened, and I've been married now almost 16 years. And it was only 2 or 3 years ago that someone reminded me of this, a young woman who I've worked with on the debating circuit afterwards. She was like, you did that, and it's just like, oh, okay, we're allowed to stand up for ourselves when things like this happen. I had no idea that anyone had been paying attention in that way. So that part that, and I mean, we've talked about this once in the Sunday chats where that's one of the things that's helped me realize that, no, it's important to say this just so that you create the space for other people who maybe don't have the nerve to say it for themselves or whatever. So that's been really important, and I love that has been true. I really love that. I love the fact that my being president of the Debating Society meant that there were hundreds of kids who were looking at a woman in a position of power. Because kids who debate, they care about who's heading the organization. They care who that person is. They're intimidated by that person. And I don't like being intimidating per se, but I like the idea that they think a woman is someone who holds that authority.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's been interesting to grow into that realization that I'm now at a point where, what I say and do also matters because there are people who are looking up. And so I have to live up to that at some level.
Yeah, but some people feel, I think, almost threatened just by the word of feminism.
Sure.
What do you think they're so afraid of?
Change. A lot of people are afraid of change. I also think, for a lot of women, especially women in my mom's generation, but even in my own generation, I think they feel, if they aren't feminists themselves, that my being a feminist is somehow an attack on them. That if you're a feminist, you're saying that their choices are not valid. And that's threatening. I think it's also upsetting for a lot of women because they didn't have the space or the examples of people who were willing to say that, no, that's not right. No, people shouldn't be able to treat you that way. And so you have these women who've given up their whole lives to family and to husband and to children and so they have to rationalize those choices at some level. So for some of them it's a genuine choice, and even if they had to do it over again, they were happy with that, and that's fine. But I think the angriest protectors of patriarchy are the ones who suffered and can't bear the thought that suffering was not necessary. Yeah. So for women, I think that's where the threat comes. For men, again, I mean, if you're a decent man, if you're a decent human being, then again, feminism can feel like a rebuke. And at some level, at this point, I'm just like, well, it should. I mean, you're living in a world that is structured around your comfort rather than mine, and how dare you tell me I shouldn't be upset about it? Yeah.
Sorry. Do you often think about the legacy that you are leaving behind, or not really? Or the impact?
I didn't used to. I've had to think about it a lot in the last year. So in my final year as president of the organization, I was really doing a lot of thinking about, well, how do you structure things so that some of the things that we've done don't fall apart? And it can be hard because, especially with a volunteer organization, it's a small group of people who are doing things. And so one person changes the tenor of the organization quite a bit. And so I've thought about it a lot in that context. The other thing is that I had mentioned the Women's Action Forum. And so there are these women who I've looked up to since I was a little girl. And in the past 3 or 4 years, they've started to pass away. So, I mean, you may have heard about Asma Jahangir. She's a really well-known lawyer, did a lot of, she was amazing, tiny little woman, and just unafraid of anyone. But, so that's been a real wake-up also, where, the stalwarts are going and someone has to step up. So that's a real, and again, I mean, in a country where education comes to so few, then those of us who have it, you can't just sit on your rear end and just enjoy those comforts. I can't. And I that part, it really bothers me when people are content to be complacent. I have a hard time with that.
Changing the subject for a little bit more soft theme. Do you have any favorite book that you can recommend us? Or at this time, what is your favorite book?
Let's see. Recently, I've been reading Hilary Mantel and Elena Ferrante. So the Neapolitan novels, and I really fell in love with My Brilliant Friend. I loved that book. I loved the way it is unabashedly written by a woman about the inner world of girls, and like it talks about stuff that doesn't show up in other books. Usually. In a way that's just, and it's like a lot of times when writers do talk about those parts, they talk about it in ways that are meant for male readers at some level, readers that don't necessarily, and this one just doesn't bother to do that. It's like this is what I'm writing about, and you have to be, I think you have to be a girl to recognize a lot of the things that she's describing. And it's really great. I love that about it. And the other one is the Wolf Hall. It's a historical trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's advisor. And I've always loved history. And again, she's a really great writer. So those are books that I'm reading a memoir in Urdu by a newspaper editor, and that's really interesting too because he's cool.
Okay, so. And do you ever been in Portugal?
I
no,
wish.
Right? Yes, yeah. When are you coming? We are waiting. Okay.
I would love to know. I mean,
please come.
Yeah. Let's get rid of this damn pandemic. And I really would. No, I mean, that's been one of the greatest things about the pandemic, making friends around the world in ways that I would not have done otherwise. So, and of course with Portugal, because, I mean, the friends I've made internationally are either from college or from the debating circuit. And so you have people from countries that debate in English, even if they, so I do know people from Slovenia, and I know people from Estonia, and I know people from Peru, but Portugal doesn't come to the World Schools Debating Championship, and neither does Spain, and it's understandable. Because if you were debating, you'd debate in Portuguese. Why would you debate in English?
I think it's something that I don't even know if we have debate teams.
That's
really
true. Well, yeah. I mean, not often the schools offer that type of club.
In the whole country, maybe there's some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And I mean, in Pakistan and in India, if a school has any extracurricular activities at all, you can be sure that speech is one of them. Like it's a given. So it's really interesting because debate and drama, like that's something that schools do, whether they do other things or not. So that's I find it fascinating that you could have an education system that doesn't have debate.
Yeah. We also don't often have drama in school. A lot of times people have it out of school. A lot of our extracurriculars are.
Sure.
Drama
that
is
makes sense.
More common than debate, for sure. Yeah. So yes, after the pandemic, please come visit us.
Oh, I'd love to.
So we always have a question that was sent from one of the other guests, and this is a deep one. I'm going to try to ask it correctly. But the question is, why can the brightest childhood be the most haunted?
Oh. Why can the brightest childhood be the...
Well, I mean, from another teacher now that I'm thinking about, yeah.
I can think of a lot of reasons why that might be true. One is that I think a lot of times when you say, depends on how you mean bright, I guess. So let's look at that. So one is like really intelligent. So bright in the sense of smart. And I think that's, if you are smart, then you see things that other people don't see. And so they touch you in ways that maybe other people don't feel. So that's one. Also, if you're much smarter than everyone around you, then that can be very socially isolating. And so you can end up with emotional scars from that, just because it hurts to be socially isolated.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, if you're talking about bright in the sense of like seemingly open and wonderful and exciting and all of that, well, oftentimes those things are a cover for darker things, like because, and also, I mean, if you experience the good things on 50, then you're also likely to experience the bad things on 50. So it's that also, that if you're sensitive and given to big expression, then you're also expressing unhappiness in the same way and feeling then you just feel more deeply. So yeah. So that would be my explanation for why they might be.
So, as you know, or I hope you know, our podcast is called Especialmente Normal. That means specially normal. So the next question is, what do you consider specially normal?
Ooh.
Something normal, but very, very special.
Well, I mean, just yesterday, I was absolutely gushing over a freshly baked bun. And no, I mean, like really, like I sat there and I was like, oh my God, this is so good. And it was nothing. It was just a homemade bun. There was nothing It was perfectly normal. There's nothing special about it otherwise.
But it felt special.
It was great. It just melted in my mouth, and I was transported. So things like that. Sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee and just watching the birds. It's been one of my favorite things. I grew up moving around a lot. And so my husband's family home is the home that I've actually lived in the longest. And so that front porch, just sitting there and looking at the trees, and it's just, yeah, that's a happy place. There's nothing, it's totally normal, like it's just your front porch. But
it's very special also.
It's very special.
Yeah, that's nice. So we are almost in the end, but I still have one question. Okay. That is, what is the question that no one ever ask you and you wish someone would?
Well, you know, she told me that you'd be asking me this, and I've been thinking.
This is the only one.
Yeah, that's true.
I've been thinking for weeks about what that question might be. And
we've been thinking about it since the first edition, and I still don't have an answer for that one.
Yeah.
And it's like, so if for me, if I were asking about a personal question, that would be it. Like, what does it mean to have homes that are so different? Yeah. And how does that shape you? And I really wonder why people don't care to know the answer to that, because it is so fundamental to who I am that I have always been split between these places. And I hadn't realized it at some level. Like, I see my husband, and he's always been, he was born in Lahore. He grew up sure, he's lived in other parts of Punjab, but he's grown up in Punjab. He spent a few years in Saudi Arabia, but even that was in a Pakistani kind of setting. Very, very grounded in his cultural background. It's really interesting to me. I mean, like, both of us have grandparents who were in India, and our parents are the ones who moved to Pakistan. And yet his connection to India is so much deeper than mine is, because as a child he used to go back every vacation. And at some level I'm rootless because I've moved around so much. So that's...
So yes, we reached the end. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us.
Thank you for asking me. It's been fun.
Thank you for this lovely talk. It was
really lovely talking to you too.
Yeah, thank you.
And Thelma.
And Thelma. So yes, we're gonna
listen everything.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Aisha.
We're going to end this episode now. For everyone who is listening or watching, thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you. Bye.